Hello, and welcome back to the Crime Reel. For this week's true crime narration, we shall be looking at the life of Peter Fell from Lancashire, which is in the northwest of England. Peter Allen Fell was born in 1961. He was the first child of Alan and Maureen Fell. Alan and Maureen had a difficult relationship, and their marriage ended in divorce in 1965. At that time, 4-year-old Peter and his younger brother Paul were put into care. After a short spell living with foster parents, the two boys were sent to live in a foster home in Weymouth on the southern coast of England, some 300 miles from where they had previously lived. Several years later, when Peter was 10 years old, he was once again rehomed. Together with his brother Paul, he was sent back to Lancashire to live at the Blake Gardens Children's Home before another move led to him being placed with foster parents. The two brothers attended the Northern High School in Rishton, Lancashire, where Peter was remembered to be a lonely child who seemed to be crying out for attention. At the age of 16, Peter left school and joined the Royal Transport Corps. During his time in the army, he would often exaggerate and lie about events, including twice claiming to have been attacked by civilians, and he was eventually thrown out after a review by disciplinary officers. On Monday, the 10th of May 1982, it was a cold day for the time of year. Sometime before 3 p.m, 45-year-old Anne Lee left her home in Highfield Gardens, Aldershot, with her black Labrador, Monty. Walking the short distance to Highfield Avenue, she called upon her friend, 66-year-old Margaret Johnson. Margaret, together with her red setter, Tara, joined Anne on her walk. The two women regularly walked their dogs together around nearby Aldershot Common. At around 3:15 p.m, a third lady was also out walking her dog. As she approached the area known as Hungry Hill, she came across the bodies of Anne and Margaret. They had both been stabbed multiple times. Their bodies had been left around 100 metres from the busy A325 road between Aldershot and Farnham. This was also in close proximity to an army building. They had been brutally stabbed to death in broad daylight. Their dogs, Monty and Tara, were wandering helplessly nearby. Both Anne and Margaret were fully dressed in their jackets, trousers and boots. Additionally, they were both still wearing their jewellery. Both a sexual motive and theft was soon ruled out by the investigating team. Both women were married with children, and in Margaret's case, grandchildren as well. They had been friends for years and often walked their dogs together. They lived a quiet life, and their murders came as a huge shock to the local community. The autopsy revealed that Margaret had been stabbed 11 times and Anne 5 times in a brutal and seemingly motiveless attack. There were no witnesses to the crime, and any sightings of people who were in the area at the time were soon ruled to be irrelevant to the inquiry. A photo fit was circulated of a man who had been seen in the vicinity, who the police were unable to locate, but this again led nowhere. Over 100 officers became involved in the case, conducting a massive search of the surrounding woodland in the hope of finding the murder weapon, but without success. The day after the attack, Peter was in a pub in the Aldershot area. After leaving the pub, and having clearly consumed a significant amount of alcohol, Peter made a call to the police. The call was not recorded, but the details were noted down. Peter stated that he had met a man in the pub that evening, and that man had got very drunk and had started to talk to him about the murders. Peter went on to say that the man kept saying how sorry he was that he had done it. Peter said the man lived at 10 York Road in Aldershot, his own address. When the police did not visit Peter as a result of his call, he phoned again late the following evening. Again, he had been drinking heavily and repeated the information that he had given the previous day. However, Peter was not interviewed in regard to either of these calls at this time. 1 week after the murders, on the 17th of May 1982, Margaret and Anne's dogs were used in a reconstruction of the events of the previous Monday afternoon, and whilst this led to more information, unfortunately, this information did not lead to an arrest. Following this, on the 19th of May 1982, the police began making house-to-house inquiries in the area. During this time, Peter was interviewed, along with many other residents, and he was asked to provide some answers to a standard set of questions regarding his whereabouts on the 10th of May. Peter stated that he had been to the bank and had then gone to work. He was ruled out as a suspect. The case continued with little progress. Later that year, Peter moved to Bournemouth, where he married a lady by the name of Anne, and they were soon expecting their first child. The marriage was short-lived, and it is believed that the couple had separated before the birth of their baby, a daughter named Sarah. Peter, who was by now working as a hospital porter, was once again drinking heavily, and in the summer of 1983, he made a series of calls to the Bournemouth Police Department. These calls were made late in the evening, and he was clearly drunk when making them. He identified himself as Peter and gave his address. He confessed to the double murder once again, but stated the date of the murders incorrectly. Shortly after, Peter was arrested and taken to Farnborough Police Station for questioning. It has been reported that he was held for 72 hours without access to a solicitor, despite repeated requests for one. Over the course of these 3 days, there were multiple interviews, and despite being offered food, Peter refused to eat. Initially, he denied any involvement in the murders, stating that he had made the phone calls because he wanted to be somebody and was bored and lonely. The interviews continued, and he later went on to make a partial confession, saying that he'd met the two women and struck one of them with his fists because she reminded him of his mother, who he hated. He said that he had no recollection of using a knife and subsequently retracted his confession. At the time, Peter was known to the police as someone who often made up stories, having previously confessed to the crimes of the Yorkshire Ripper, Peter Sutcliffe. Nevertheless, on the 18th of October 1983, 21-year-old Peter was charged with the murder of Anne Lee and Margaret Johnson. The case went to trial at Winchester Crown Court on the 9th of July 1984 and lasted for 19 days. At trial, Peter protested his innocence, claiming that he had made up his confession in order to get attention. There was no forensic evidence linking him to the crime, and the murder weapon had never been found. His defence team also showed that he was at the bank in Victoria Road, Aldershot, at the time of the murders, and as such could not have committed them. Additionally, in the week before the trial, Peter was assessed by a doctor who diagnosed him as a serial confessor. Peter did not testify. The prosecution argued that Peter had confessed to the crimes, having made 13 phone calls to the police, during which he named himself as the killer. In addition, they provided details of how he had been identified by several people from the photo fit that was circulated at the time of the crime. After deliberating for around 10 hours, spread over 2 days, the 5 men and 7 women on the jury reached a majority verdict of 10-2. They found Peter guilty of both murders. On the 9th of August 1984, Peter was sentenced to life in prison. He continued to protest his innocence and appealed his conviction. This appeal was rejected in November 1985. Another 14 years passed before, in September 1999, his case was referred back to the Court of Appeal by the Criminal Cases Review Commission. During the hearing, Patrick O'Connor QC accused the police of putting Peter under extreme pressure when he was in a vulnerable state. Psychiatric evidence showed that Peter had a suggestible personality, was a fantasist, and a serial confessor. On the 1st of December 2000, after spending 16 years in prison, Peter was released on bail after it was agreed that his conviction was unsafe. He had to remain at a bail hostel in London until the outcome of his appeal hearing. 3 months later, on the 5th of March 2001, Peter was fully exonerated, becoming a free man. After his conviction was quashed, Peter said, "If I dwell on it, it will just do me more harm, so I don't want to dwell on it. I'll just take one day at a time. I've always believed that one day I would be proved innocent." And when he was asked why he had confessed to the murders, he said, "I used to say a lot of silly things, but did not realise they would be used against me at the trial." With Peter being fully exonerated, Margaret and Anne's killer has never been brought to justice. The case remains open, but will only be reinvestigated if new evidence comes to light, which, almost 30 years later, seems incredibly unlikely to happen. Peter is entitled to claim compensation for his ordeal, but I've been unable to find if this has been paid, and if so, how much he received. That concludes today's case. Please add any comments down below about the story. Thanks very much for listening to The Crime Reel. Stay safe. Goodbye. Psst. When Peter won his appeal, his team went to a London wine bar to celebrate. Peter's choice of drink was a cup of tea. It's what the English do. Goodbye.